Fine. Great. Get your water. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is David Pryor. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics. We want to say to each and every one of you who have come out this evening how proud we are that you are a part of our forum series. This is Harvard's premier arena for political speech, discussion, and debate. And sometimes it gets a little lively around here, and so we want you to just relax and listen to two very, very fine presenters this evening. In 1966, the Kennedy family established the Institute of Politics, we call it the IOP, as a living memorial to President John F. Kennedy. For more than 35 years, our mission has been to unite students and academics, politicians, activists, policymakers on a nonpartisan basis in order to stimulate and nurture an interest in public service. Tonight we have the distinguished honor of hosting two of America's leading experts on one of our country's most difficult and contentious public policy issues. I'm talking, yes, about affirmative action. This issue is a complex issue with many dimensions for all Americans, whether they be black, white, Asian, Latino, or another race, or whether they are male or female. Tomorrow, think about this, tomorrow it will be 41 years to the date that President John F. Kennedy first coined the term affirmative action. In a 1961 executive order, President Kennedy created the Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity and mandated that federal contractors receiving federal funds must not discriminate against any employee or applicant for employment because of race, creed, color, or national origin. The contractor will take, quote unquote, affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed, that employees are treated during employment without regard to race, creed, color, or national origin. What seemed to be a call for colorblind contracting was soon enlarged by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And a year after signing the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination of all kinds, President Johnson laid out his vision for affirmative action in a commencement address at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He said, and I quote, "You do not take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and simply say you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair." Following in the footsteps of his predecessor, President Johnson issued his own executive order, where Kennedy required contractors not to discriminate in hiring or promotion. President Johnson gave Kennedy's earlier order some teeth, making contractors meet certain requirements to ensure quality in hiring. President Nixon comes to the White House. He carried on the fight for civil rights while guarding against potential abuse. In his Philadelphia order, Nixon argued for affirmative action to increase minority employment while setting up definite goals and timetables. President Nixon stopped short of establishing quotas. However, the issue of quotas would arise almost 9 years later. In the landmark case, Regents of the Southern University of California versus Bakey, Alan Bakey, a white applicant, was rejected twice from the University of California, Davis Medical School, claiming that there were minority applicants admitted with scores lower than his. The court ruled in that case that while race could not be a factor in admission decisions. The use of quotas similar to those used by the University of California were unacceptable. However, 1 year later, the Supreme Court ruled that some modest quotas were perfectly constitutional. It has been almost 24 years since the Bakey case, and today the debate over affirmative action is more alive and even more contentious than ever. Through court cases raged on between '78 and the '90s, with changes and controversies surrounding every aspect of this issue, the fundamental dispute in Bakey remained at the center stage. So much so that in 1995, President Bill Clinton, with the counsel of one of tonight's panelists, gave his famous "Mend It, Don't End It" speech, which amounted to a reaffirmation of the court's position against quotas, but for continued affirmative action. But like Mr. Bakey, some critics of affirmative action continued to believe that preferences of any kind amounts to reverse discrimination. In the state of California, this view, championed by our other panelists, triumphed with the passage of Proposition 209, which forbade the state to discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting, unquote. Tonight, we will discuss both sides of this issue with the two leading experts in America in this field. We're privileged. On my right, Ward Connolly, appointed by then California Governor Pete Wilson to the Board of Regents of the University of California, 1993. 1996, served as chairman of the California Civil Rights Initiative, which campaigned for Proposition 209, effectively ending affirmative action in the state of California. Since then, he has gained national attention as an outspoken advocate of equal opportunity for everyone, regardless of race, sex, or creed. He has also run similar ballot initiatives across the country, I should say, most notably in Washington State. He is the author of the autobiographical book, Creating Equal, My Fight Against Race Preferences. He provides a vision for an America in which all types of discrimination are absent from society. While some have criticized Mr. Connerly, others have lauded him as a selfless crusader, bending traditional political lines and risking vilification to fight for something which he truly believes. To my left, and we didn't do it this way on purpose, I want you to know, is a real icon around this part, Harvard Law Professor Christopher Edley. Professor Edley has taught at the Harvard Law School since 1981, specializing in civil rights and administrative law. He is a veteran of the Carter and the Clinton administrations, has served as an advisor to the Dukakis and Gore presidential campaigns. During the Clinton administration, Professor Edley served as a special counsel to the president and director of the White House Review on Affirmative Action, where we helped create Mend It, Don't End It policy. He is the author of Not All Black and White, Affirmative Action, Race, and American Values. In his book, he analyzes the current flaws in affirmative action law and proposes ways to amend them. He has said that while affirmative action is not the solution to America's discrimination problems, affirmative action is one element of the solution. And the campaign to eliminate it without effective replacement policies is symptomatic of America's great malady. Professor Edley is currently co-director of the Civil Rights Project at Harvard University. He is a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. We want to thank both of our panelists for coming tonight. Before we begin, I'd like to call on the audience to play a critical role in this evening's debate. First, turn off your cell telephones, please. Thank you very much. Before we get to the next step, we would like to say, we all have an opinion in these matters that will be debated this evening, some more passionately than others. In saying that, I would like to remind all of you in our audience, be courteous, to be respectful of the views of tonight's guest speakers and audience members who pose the questions. It is in the civilized exchange of ideas and opinions that is the basis of our free speech and democracy, as well as the hallmark of this forum at the Kennedy School of Government. Each speaker will make a 10-minute opening statement, followed by questions from the audience, and Professor Edley will make our first statement. Professor Edley.
Thank you very much, Senator. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight, and welcome, of course, and thanks to my distinguished bald opponent over there. Look, by dawn on September 12th, mere 2 or 3 news cycles after the tragedy, just about everybody in Washington was awakening to the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency didn't have very many people in its employ who could do the job that needed to be done. Doesn't it make sense that we would engage in affirmative action in order to ensure the excellence of the Central Intelligence Agency and our national security apparatus in dealing with the challenges facing America? Would it make any sense at all to say that we're going to hire covert operatives based upon a test score, as opposed to thinking expansively and accurately about the ingredients of excellence needed in order to get the job done? Afghanistan is riven by tribalism. And yet, the first serious steps to try to build a stable government that could deliver opportunity and justice was put together around a conference table in which people recognized that the beginning of healing involved recognizing difference, not ignoring it, but addressing it. To get beyond tribalism, it was first necessary to come to grips with tribalism. When I try to teach my students about the enormous challenges facing America in bringing about comprehensive and effective reform of K-12 education, what they learn from each other, what I learn from them, is enriched enormously by the diversity of the viewpoints, experiences, perspectives represented in my classroom. Harvard Law School aspires to be not simply the best law school on the planet, but the best law school in this part of the universe. If we simply picked people based upon a test score, we would not be excellent in the sense of the quality of the learning that takes place in my classroom. When we started the Affirmative Action Review at the White House back in 1995, one of the first things that President Clinton did in response to a question from the then Chief of Staff, Leon Panetta asked him, "Mr. President, what's your basic position on affirmative action?" Just to get us going. The President said, "Well, I'm in favor of equal opportunity, I'm against discrimination, and I'm against quotas." And everybody said, "Yeah, that's great, that's good, that's good." And I said, "Well, wait a minute. What does that mean?" Any mainstream politician could say exactly those words. David Duke could say exactly those words. So what does that mean? It is important in discussing issues of race, including affirmative action, that we strive to get beyond the platitudes. Many people are fond of saying that there's more that unites us than that divides us. Well, I hate that. I hate that. Because even if it's true, the way to solve the problems we face is to try to deal with the things that divide us, not to try to paper them over. One of the things that divides us is color. Affirmative action is not about quotas. Quotas are illegal, have always been illegal. If you're operating a quota, it is not affirmative action, and anybody who defends affirmative action should feel under no obligation whatsoever to defend a quota, by which I mean, as the law means, a rigid numerical straitjacket. Affirmative action is not the antithesis of merit. Affirmative action, properly understood and implemented, is a way of pursuing merit by being inclusive. If I ask you in picking members of an orchestra this simple question, people are auditioning, you've got one slot left, do you pick the best musician? Well, most of you, I probably would say yes. But of course, the answer is that if the best musician is a violinist, but the spot you have to fill is for somebody who plays the oboe, you've got to think about something else. You've got to think about the palette of talents necessary to create success. So too, when we are deciding who will be in the cabinet, who will be in a classroom, who will be in a workforce. Merit, properly understood, is about many variables. And in some circumstances, diversity, on any of a number of grounds, is critical. Ask the CIA. Affirmative action, however, is not costless. I believe that there is a cost, a moral cost, to making decisions about individuals or to allocating resources by making use of immutable characteristics like race, ethnicity, gender. I think there is a cost. The question in my mind is whether that is a cost we should be willing to pay at this moment in American history in at least some circumstances. And I believe the answer is yes. But it has to be done in a way that seeks to minimize those costs and maximize the benefits. It should not be done lightly. It must be done carefully. The circumstances that might justify paying that cost include the need to remedy and prevent discrimination. But they also include the need to be inclusive in the pursuit of excellence. Let me close by suggesting that it's important for all of us, because of those costs, to be prepared to address the question, when will it end? Because there's some people who oppose affirmative action and say, I was for it in 1965 and even in 1975, but this is the new millennium. And I think the answer is we should end it when the need for it has disappeared. When we are confident that discrimination, including the subtle forms of discrimination, have been eliminated, so that we no longer need a tool to help us lean against those simple human tendencies to prefer people like ourselves. And we should eliminate it when other processes of selection manage to produce the kind of diversity we need for excellence. But until then, with America's exploding diversity and the challenges that that presents to us, we cannot afford to lay aside a tool that remains valuable, constructive, and the door to opportunity for many, many people. Thank you.
Mr. Ward Carnley.
W.C. Fields always said, start each day with a laugh and get it over with. As I listen to my hairy friend comment upon my lack of hair, I'm reminded of my experience in this very room about 3 years ago when someone else insulted me, and I say that kiddingly. But at the time, I walked away thinking, I'll never go back there again. And it reminded me of the $99 cruise around the world that the guy read about. He read about this cruise, and he goes into the travel agent and writes out his check for $99, and travel agent takes out a baseball bat, pounds him over the head, and ties him up. drags him out to the pier, throws him in the van, throws him in the ocean, says bon voyage. And this other fellow found out about the same cruise, $99, goes in, signs the check, travel agent takes him in, pounds him over the head, drags him out, throws him in the ocean, bon voyage. These two guys are floating along on their backs. One of them leans over to his left and says, I wonder if they feed you on this cruise. The other guy leans over and says, they didn't last year. So here I am back here taking his abuse. I never learned. Chris is a very distinguished individual for whom I have profound respect, but he's wrong. He's just flat out wrong on this. Earlier today, I was in Professor Ken Williams' class, and one of the students, Chris, made a great statement, asked the question, and he prefaced it by asking whether I, as a black conservative, felt that my position was contributing to the advancement of black Americans, and Chris and I had a little dialogue about that. I am a conservative on most things, not all. My label doesn't dictate my views, but I am a conservative, proudly. But race is not one thing that I'm influenced by political ideology. I grew up in the Deep South, born in Leesville, Louisiana, 1939, coming from a family like the majority of black Americans that had already begun to blend, already begun to melt into that melting pot of America. And I will never forget the feeling of being black in Louisiana as a Negro, a colored man, denied access to most public accommodations, denied access to schools, feeling constantly that you were inferior was something that never left you. You felt that you were inferior. The thing that sustained me and those of my generation was not the prospect of, quote, affirmative action. It was the belief that we were equal. The thing that Martin Luther King proclaimed, and those on his side don't like for me to invoke the name of Dr. King. But the thing that sustained us, my friends, was the belief that this country at its core had a creed, that all of us were created by God as equals. As equals. And if God created us that way, then it was an obligation of government to treat us that way. Created as equals. And Dr. King said, live out the meaning of your creed. Live out the meaning of your creed. That was the thing that sustained us, Chris. That sustained us. The belief in individual equality and the obligation of government to treat us that way. And so I arrive at this moment in time trying to reconcile the view that, quote, affirmative action, which I support in its right manifestations, you know that, but affirmative action as a way of treating people differently on the basis of skin color, on the basis of whatever it is that we call race. As our people marry across lines of race and have children, and the children don't know which box to check. My own grandkids of Irish descent and African descent and Vietnamese descent and Choctaw Indian descent and Canadian French. What do you want them to check? So as the concept of race is changing, I find it so odd that otherwise enlightened people are clinging to this notion that race is fixed, that we've got these 5 basic food groups of white and black and Native American and Asian, and that we can classify and divide people on the basis of them. Here in the 21st century, 160 languages spoken in the LA school district. People from all around the globe melting into each other. And we cling to the one-drop rule, classifying people on the basis of race, conferring benefits on the basis of race. How do we maintain a civilized society without having rules that are fixed? Kim, when I left your class, the thought haunted me of the different students who posed the question, well, what if the number at Berkeley, the number of underrepresented students, goes down? Would you then admit that you made a mistake? If the question of equality is a moral proposition, my friend, as you said, is morality something that we suspend? Do we just say the price is okay to make sure we have a few more at Berkeley? Do we suspend convictions in the interest of expediency? You may say the price is okay, Chris. I say it's not. I say that there are some things that we as a nation have to believe in, and we have to practice them. Ironically, as we become more diverse, as you said, that's the very argument for getting away from this concept of classifying people and meting out benefits on the basis of classifications. It's the very reality of diversity that brings down your argument. The very reality that we're changing so rapidly. Groups are so fluid. People don't know which box to fit into. That makes it more difficult to sustain that paradigm. 20 years ago, when it was a black-white phenomenon, yeah, you might have argued that we have to do something to help this group, which has been oppressed by that group. It is far more difficult with recent immigrants. It is far more difficult when the groups are so fluid to sustain that paradigm. So, I submit to you that what we need to do is to ensure that we're providing assistance on the basis of need, income. A child who's never had a parent go to college, yes, that person is entitled to affirmative action. We need to have programs like the Top 4% plan that we have at the University of California. We need to admit students comprehensively on the basis of factors other than grade point averages and SAT scores. But never, never do we look at the color of somebody's skin and say, because we think you are whatever, we're going to set aside or even take into account and give you some subtle preference on the basis of race. That violates every belief that I think we ought to have. Thank you.
Good. Immediately following our program this evening in the IOP conference room right around the corner, there will be a student-led discussion of affirmative action. We urge all of you to come in there and participate and sort of keep this discussion going. Now we're going to open up for questions. We're going to get right into questions. And I'm going to impose a little affirmative action myself here tonight by saying that we're going to let the first 4 questions at least come from students. We're going to emphasize student questions tonight. So if we have people who would like to come forward, we have 4 microphones, 2 on this floor, and I believe 2 in the top tier. And once again, the IOP conference room will be the scene of a student-led discussion. We'll come right here, and then we'll go up to this mic. Yes, sir. Pardon me. Would you please, when you ask your question, state your name, and also would you keep your question short? And we would like to ask our panelists also to sort of keep their answers succinct. Thank you.
All right. My name's Fred. I'm a sophomore at the college. And when you were talking, Mr. Connerly, I was struck by how much you talked about your background, how much it contributed to who you were and to your ideology. And I mean, even though you said that your race is very distinct from your ideology, I mean, no one should assume that a person has a certain ideology because of their race. It's still, because, even though it's a social construct, it has social meaning, and it contributes to the way we see the world. It's impossible for it not to, as you demonstrated by speaking so much about your background. So my question for you is it really, and I mean, and there are other things that colleges do, like look at whether someone's from Wyoming, because they realize that contributes to their background. It contributes to what they're going to bring to the floor. I'm sorry, I'm going to make it really quick. I just want to make that point.
We need to move on.
Okay, so that's my question for you. Did you understand?
Why not take into account race if you're taking into account all these other things? Is that
right? Because
okay?
Because race in particular has even more social meaning than whether I'm from Wyoming or Georgia or New York.
I think that your being from Georgia or Wyoming, Fred, is something that is not immutable. It is something that if I think that kids are getting a benefit by living in Wyoming or wherever, I could move there. But I can't change the color of my skin. And that is why race is the thing that we have sort of said as a policy that we will not make decisions on the basis of that. When Senator Pryor was making his introduction, he read a passage from the executive order that was issued that started this all off, and also the '64 Civil Rights Act. If you'll think back to what he said, we're all guaranteed the right to equal access, equal treatment, and affirmative action will be taken without regard to race. Given our history, race is something that we have said this is one of those things that we're not going to use in the equation. We've made that decision. The law says without regard to race. And once you start saying, well, we're going to treat race the same as we will legacy admits, let's say, or the same as we do whether you live in Wyoming or whatever, then you're affecting people, it seems to me, by things over which they have no control. I can be an athlete, maybe a lousy one, but I can be an athlete. I can be a legacy admit. I can live in Wyoming, geography, whatever. Race is different.
Professor Edley is going to respond also.
I actually agree with the proposition that race is different. I think the fact that there are legacy admits, the fact that a selective school may pay attention to geography and admissions doesn't demonstrate that it's perfectly fine to pay attention to race. What it does demonstrate is that that institution has a complex notion of merit, and that someone who suggests that the institution does or should only pay attention to certain indicia of academic accomplishment is just false, because the institution pays attention to a lot more than that. One needs, and I think there are available, a separate set of arguments as to why it is valuable to pay attention to gender, to race, and other things. It is not a matter, Ward, of suspending morality in order to do it. It's a matter of recognizing that there are multiple claims on our morality at stake. And that's true whether the issue is a woman's right to choose, or the death penalty, or affirmative action. There are multiple moral claims at stake, and the intellectual challenge and the political challenge is indeed to figure out how to integrate and balance those moral claims in a complex way, not I think in a superficial absolutist way. Equality, the imperative to be treated equally, actually, I don't really think that's an accurate description of what the civil rights movement or Martin Luther King was about. It was really about bringing about, I don't just want to be treated equally, I want equality. I want to dismantle color caste. And the question is, instrumentally, how to go about doing that. To be treated equally, you could be treated equally by an employer who says, I only hire people I like. A neutral rule on its face. Just so happens that the people I like are the people who are just like me. Well, when we passed the '64 Civil Rights Act, we decided that that kind of equal treatment was not equal enough. And similarly, it seems to me when we're thinking about how to remedy discrimination, how to prevent discrimination, how to bring about genuine excellence, we have to be prepared carefully to let some of these immutable factors be a consideration.
Thank you. Student in the red sweater, please.
Hi, my name is Andy Frank. I'm a freshman at the college. My question concerns, Mr. Conley, you talked about kind of America as a melting pot, and I think there's been a lot of different theories about this, whether, America is a melting pot, whether it's kind of more of a salad bowl with a lot of, like, I guess different racial or different things come in. I mean, a lot of people could argue that it's, kind of the cause of a conflict in a lot of places around the world, like, Afghanistan. If it was more of a melting pot, maybe there wouldn't be all these tribal tensions. And I wanted to ask both of you where you think America is right now in terms of a melting pot or a salad bowl, and where you think it will be and where it should go.
I think it's both. I think it's both, and I don't think that we should try to move it one way or the other. Just let nature take its course in that regard, in my view. I'm not trying to force people to melt in. I'm not trying to force them to remain their whatever their background is. Just let it be. But in the public sector, I think the government ought to steer clear of trying to make decisions on the basis of its classifications. I think the government ought to be out of that. And the same as it's out of the business of asking people, what is your religion? Are you Catholic? Are you Jewish? What's your sexual orientation? The government doesn't ask those things. Shouldn't be involved in that. And I think the same thing about physical characteristics like race. I think we're far better as a people when we get the government out of the business of classifying its citizens. Chris?
Can I just say, I agree with that. I agree with that. Be much better off if we didn't have to think about it, if we didn't have to pay any, if the government didn't have to keep track of these things. The problem is, we're not ready for that yet. The problem is, we are not going to be able to dismantle the legacy of color caste unless we have effective tools to bring that about. And at least for now, those tools include, in some circumstances, paying attention to these racial and ethnic differences. Look, I think that, I don't know on the melting pot versus the salad bowl thing. What I do know is actually Clinton was very when he was creating this racial reconciliation, this advisory board that John Hope Franklin chaired. There was a meeting that he had in June of '97, and he had this group of 8 people in the Oval Office with him and the vice president, and I was there as designated schmoozer. And he was talking to this group, and he said, "Look, I've sat in this office with leaders from countries around the world, sitting right there in that chair, who preside over societies in which thousands of people are murdered every month because of racial, tribal, religious differences. And they look at America with amazement that with our diversity, we have managed to hold things together." And now we all know that there are tremendous problems. But Clinton said that with all of this diversity that we're facing and growing, exploding, all of the challenges that represents, unless America does a better job at coming to grips with our differences effectively, engaging them, or not ignoring them, but engaging them and constructing policies, public and private, that will effectively bridge the gaps, not ignore the gaps, but bridge the gaps, we could fly apart. Every nation around the world throughout human history has struggled with difference, And we in America are not immune from that risk. We ignore it at our peril. This is what I used to call his apocalyptic Bosnia scenario.
Right here, up here, the red sweater.
Good evening.
Seems like there are a lot of red sweaters tonight.
Yeah, it's the season for red, maybe.
Okay.
My name is Wayne Thornhill. I'm in the mid-career MPA program. I guess my question is focused to Mr. Connolly, but Mr. Edley, you certainly can respond. It's always interesting how we take Martin Luther King and freeze him in time. The interesting thing is, you quote from '63, but you want us to believe that Martin Luther King never grew any older. He never matured in his thinking. And I think that's a distortion of who he really was. I think the reality is, if you take the statement that he wants to pursue this race-neutral society, you must also include the whole idea that he said America has failed the Negro. And in a real sense, as we see King mature, he also moves to a theory that talks about even resegregating because the economic structure does not have a sense of parity. So I would appreciate that if we ever quote, I don't think it's a matter of saying conservative liberal don't like you to quote. We just would appreciate you to put them in context. And then the second part is that if we talk about marginalized communities, how do we address the historic wrongs? If you talk about the GI Bill, it was affirmative action. If you talk about the Japanese internment, that was affirmative action. So only when we talk about blacks, specifically race, that seemingly the issue always gets a little fuzzy, a convenient conservative. That's what I consider you to be. And so in a real sense,
What is the question?
How do you address the issue of redressing wrongs to blacks?
Ward?
I hope it remains a civil discussion.
You said it would be.
The use of Dr. King's name is not to give sustenance or to prop up my own views, but rather, as I would use anybody else, to provide some continuum of thought for our nation's philosophy. But if Dr. King had never lived, if he had never lived, if he had never grown, if I never had to put it in context, I know in my soul that I don't want to treat anybody the way I don't want them to treat me. And so the philosophy of equality stems from within, stems from my own experience. Addressing the wrongs, the historic wrongs of black people is something that the nation, all of us as a nation, have to do. But I don't think we do that by giving you personally, a benefit based on something that might have happened to your ancestors. I just don't think we do it. And the courts, Chris, as you know, have not been kind to that view. They've not been kind to that view at all.
How?
Pardon me?
How?
They've struck it down. They've struck it down. They've struck it down.
I'm saying how? What is your solution? We've talked.
My solution is that we treat each other as equals, number one. That's a big start. And then we have outreach programs in all phases of our lives to make sure that we provide people with access, that we eliminate discrimination. There's nothing wrong with affirmative action aggressively practiced in a non-race basis. I also am not convinced that we have to send everybody to college. And I say that as a regent. There are a lot of people that are trapped in positions in inner cities and the barrio and every place else who will never set foot on a college campus. But we seem to have this view that everybody has to go to college, and everybody has to go to Berkeley, and everybody has to go to Harvard. And so we construct these programs of benefit on that, in my view, fallacious presumption. I would like to see us provide as much assistance to that person who wants to graduate from high school, graduate from community college, go into a trade, do whatever they want to do. Give them the $25,000 stipend. Give them the scholarship to make productive use of their lives. But I don't think that giving anybody a preference on the basis of race is going to solve that problem.
Chris, do you want to go with this?
Yeah, I'm trying very, very hard to find points of agreement with Ward. But he's making it so hard. He's making it so difficult to do. Look, I actually do not believe that affirmative action should be justified on the basis of reparations. I actually don't believe that. I actually think the far stronger moral argument is that affirmative action should be used to remedy or prevent discrimination or in order to help produce excellence. Affirmative action is not about solving the problems of unemployment, of disparities in wealth. It doesn't cure the common cold. It is a very limited tool. I mean, that's the reality. I mean, in part, I think this is something that Ward was getting at. Affirmative action for selective institutions of higher education, those for which affirmative action is really an issue, we're talking about 5, at most 10% of all four-year colleges in the country. All the other colleges aren't very selective. Affirmative action isn't really an issue. So as important as it is to talk about affirmative action, it's not the answer to the problem of purging America of its legacy of color caste. It's not. It's a whole range of strategies in addition to affirmative action that are needed in order to address that. I think that our changing demography does make things complicated. But as to immigrants, as to other groups, I would just go back to first principles, Ward, and I'd say, should somebody be entitled to, so to speak, should be a beneficiary of affirmative action? I think the answer is, well, are they a member of a group that is subject to discrimination or is at risk of being discriminated against? Are they a member of a group that we need in this organization in order to achieve our mission and be excellent? If the answer to those questions is no, then I don't think they ought to have affirmative action. But if the answer is yes, whether they came off the boat a year ago or 300 years ago is in some sense immaterial.
Chris, let me just follow up on this. You said earlier, let's do away with the platitudes.
Okay.
And then you keep talking about excellence. We want to do this to build excellence. What the devil does that mean?
I think it depends on the institution. That is to say, it depends. By excellence, I mean I want to make reference to whatever the mission is of that organization. If it's the Chicago Police Department, their responsibility is to deliver public safety in a diverse urban community. If it's my classroom at Harvard Law School, the mission is somewhat different. If it is a junior college in Pocatello, Idaho, its mission is somewhat different. If it's the CIA, its mission. So I think excellence depends upon the mission of the organization, and for precisely that reason, a plurality in Bakke recognized the importance on First Amendment grounds of allowing an institution the flexibility to define what they need in the way of an admissions program that will further their mission.
And at risk of being discriminated against, a group that's at risk of being discriminated against.
Right, I think
I'm bald.
Right.
I'm at risk.
Right,
I'm
that's
at
right.
risk.
I agree.
Now,
I agree. I agree. And I think that then the question is, no, look, no, I mean, you know, there are lots of bases for discrimination in our society. What we do when we're making public policy, or when we're making law, or when we're having a moral discourse, is we're trying to decide which differences matter. Which differences are a priority for society or a priority for our institution? It may be that we're in an institution in which, because of our history or because of the present circumstances, you know, it matters with respect to some groups, but not with respect to others. Women face discrimination in many contexts in America. Nevertheless, the Harvard Law School does not need affirmative action and admissions for women because we get lots of women without having to think about it. 20 years ago, that was not the case. It is a profound success of American higher education that we no longer need affirmative action for women. But that's not to say that in other circumstances, it wouldn't be an important tool in order to both produce equality and to produce excellence.
but I think that my institution, the company I'm running here, the company I'm running would be a far more excellent institution if I didn't have any bald black guys here. Okay? I mean, I think that it would be an excellent, much more excellent. Is that the kind of paradigm you want?
It's a great question, and I think, and the answer is that in 1964, we made a decision that certain kinds of missions, certain kinds of personal preferences, for example, of a shop owner who just wants to hire friends or just wants to hire people that they like, that we were going to rule those as out of bounds. So I agree with you that the ultimate question is which kinds of missions, if you will, are we going to declare out of bounds? But I think the kind that we're talking about in higher education, the kind that we're talking about at the Central Intelligence Agency, ought to be ruled in bounds because they are fundamental to dealing with the challenges that Bill Clinton was talking about when he talked about a diverse America in the 21st century that will fly apart unless we build mechanisms to come together.
King's X, time out just a moment. Right up here, sir. Now, in a moment, we're going to start asking some 2 or 3 questions at a time, store the questions up, but let's have a single question here, and then we'll come to this floor. Let's make our questions very brief and our answers also somewhat brief. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Brahm Elias. I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School, and since I know you can't see so well down there, I'm white.
Are you bald? No.
Give me time.
Okay.
I didn't know if that was a second light bulb sitting standing there.
I mentioned that because, Mr. Connolly, you mentioned that race is immutable, while other factors are not. So if I want to learn about what it's like to live in Wyoming, I can go there. But if I want to learn about what it's like to go through the struggles you went through growing up in Louisiana because of your race, or the complexities that your grandchildren have to deal with because they're of mixed race, I can't experience that myself. After Proposition 209 passed in California, or after the Hopwood decision ended racial preference in the universities in Texas, the numbers of people of color, especially blacks and Latinos, at the University of Texas, especially Texas Law, and at, for example, Berkeley, especially Bolt Law, dropped substantially. In some cases beneath a critical mass of discussion, and in some cases almost down to none at the law schools. So my question to Mr. Edley, but especially to you, Mr. Connolly, is how am I going to learn about race in all of its complexity, its nuance, and its fluidity if I go to Berkeley and you're not there?
Can I start with that one, Ward?
Sure.
I think, obviously, I agree it's going to be much more difficult in that circumstance, that you will suffer personally and professionally as a result, that the school will be less successful at its mission and less excellent, that it would certainly be a less interesting place to teach and attend. And I think that those are very, very real costs that ought to be weighed in the balance, just as there is a cost if indeed we pay attention to race and gender. Well, let me stop.
Ward? You may have a more difficult time learning about that than you did before 209, but is that more important than the principle of equality to me? I don't think it is. The other thing is that those who don't go to college are learning about it. People that are not on this campus and not in the college setting, they're learning about race. They're living their lives. They're doing all right. In many cases, they're doing better than they are in many campuses. Tell me how much you're learning right now. Do you associate with black kids and Hispanic kids and others? Are your classes segregated? I mean, how much interaction do you really have on many college campuses? Not a heck of a lot. There's a lot of segregation here, almost as much as church on Sunday at 11 o'clock.
This gentleman has been staying a long time. Let's take 3 of the questioners and rapid fire, get 3 questions down, and we'll answer them as we go. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Gerard McGarry, and I'm a sophomore at the college. My question is in regards to language and how the debate over affirmative action is typically framed. Senator Pryor, when he referenced affirmative action in his opening statements, talked about it in terms of preferences and preferential treatment. Professor Edley, he talked about race-based preferences and also gender-based preferences.
I never say preference.
Forgive me.
Right.
But it's still fine. Mr. Connolly, when you talked about affirmative action, you did not once mention gender. It was always about race. And this seems to be indicative of how conservatives typically frame their argument. They frame it in terms of race-based preferences. And to my knowledge, in terms of numbers, the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action have been white women. And my question is, thank you. My question is really, why do you think it is that conservatives, and Mr. Edley, if you can address this too, that'd be great, tend to frame the discussion in terms of race? Jesse Helms did the same thing in North Carolina when he was running for re-election in a tough race against a black man. I think it's based on trying to play on racial prejudices. I wonder what you both think.
Okay, that's question 1. We'll come to that in a minute. The young lady right here behind you, please.
Hello, my name is Janethia Hogues. I'm a master's degree candidate at the Graduate School of Education. I was wondering why you consider equality, or whether you consider equality to be the same as sameness, having grown up Afro-Cuban, African-American, Catholic, the daughter of a Baptist preacher, and yes, they are still married, and I was raised by both of them in Miami. I consider equality to be about things that are different being just as good, or viewed and respected as just as good, not necessarily the same. And so I wonder why you consider that, if you consider that situation, and also why you would consider that things that influence other people's views of me, like my cultural background, my gender, why that wouldn't be subject to the same preference or whatever you want to call it, why you think that that shouldn't be looked at as well.
Okay, let's take these two questioners and try to consolidate the answers. If you could, Ward, would you like to respond there?
Sure.
Thank you.
You're right, I think, on the first question. It's not just conservatives, though. I think that those on our side, my side of the argument, do in fact focus primarily on race rather than gender. But gender is also a part of the equation. It's not, to me, it's not coincidental that most of the lawsuits involving race have been filed largely by females. So gender is a factor. But I think that the other side is equally as guilty. Chris says, I never mentioned preferences. But he knows that preferences are a reality. I think that those on my side of the argument are quick to say preferences. On his side, they're quick to say, to sugarcoat it and say affirmative action, knowing full well that affirmative action may include preferences. So I think we're all equally as guilty in language and abusing language. I don't do it for reasons of race baiting. You mentioned Senator Helms. I don't do it for that reason. I'm going after preferences based on race, gender, ethnicity, national origin, not affirmative action that is not race-based. That's not my concern. Sameness. Yeah, Chris made an excellent point that we have difficulty with difference. That's the big problem we have to deal with. But the paradigm that I want to construct is one in which the government treats its citizens without regard to those differences. It doesn't say, I want to celebrate whatever your background is. The government treats you as an equal without regard to those factors, without trying to factor into the equation what your background is, and gee, do we need one of these in order to be excellent, or one of those in order to be excellent? I don't want the government to do that personally.
Look, I spent part of my life being a political hack. So let me indulge that. This is about polling and focus groups, right? And the polling data done around 209, Proposition 209, Ward's proposition out there, are very clear. If you call something a preference, opposition to it shoots up. If you call it affirmative action, there's strong majority support for it. That's why he always says preference, I always say affirmative action, right? If you talk about women, support for the policy shoots up. If you just talk about race, support for the policy drops. That's why I always talk about women. He only talks about race. Okay? That's the real politics. Now, actually, let me take the ad hominem out of it, because I don't want to attribute motives to Ward that may or may not be true, but people that he hangs out with. Okay? Right. So, on the difference issue, look, I don't want the CIA, when it's trying to hire people to go do human intelligence in South Asia, to treat people equally, in the sense that Ward means equal. I want the CIA to treat them applicants equal in the sense of saying, I will apply equally to all the applicants the question of who can best do the job that needs to be done? Who can best fill the need that I have? Right? It is not treating people equally in the sense that I think we want if an employer sets up employment rules that have the result of making it impossible for Jews to work there, or impossible for Muslims to work there, right? It is not treating people equally if a school district teaches everybody exclusively in English, ignoring whether or not an immigrant child has the capacity to understand what's going on. Treating people equally can, in fact, give rise and sustain inequality. And as I said before, our goal has to be to build a stronger America in which people, in fact, experience justice, not simply some automatic set of decision principles that ignores who they are and forces them to essentially deny their differences.
Larry and Joe, two quickies.
All right. My name is Larry Harris. I guess I'm a prospective student. Real quickly, Mr. Connolly, on your earlier dilemma over which race box to check, I would just say that you probably couldn't find a person in the building that walked in and said, "Why is Professor Edley debating the Irish guy over there?" And then I would also ask both of you to talk a little bit about present-day propositions for amending affirmative action, such as in Texas, the affirmative, I guess, access program is called.
Joe?
My question is that just as we choose ethnicity, as we cannot choose our ethnicity, we also cannot choose our economic circumstances. And it's been shown that how well people succeed in educational institutions and economically in life tends to tie more closely with the economic circumstances they grew up in than the race they grew up in. And I'm wondering why it has been chosen, this discussion is focused completely on race and not at all on these economic circumstances, and why we must correct, if the goal is equality and opportunity, why we must only focus on race and whether economic circumstances should also be brought in.
Well, let me say that to me it's a false choice. I'm in favor of paying attention to economics and wealth, et cetera. But I also believe that there are some circumstances in which that doesn't get the job done. And by getting the job done, I mean, that doesn't create the full sense of excellence or the full sense of justice that I'm trying to achieve. So my general sense of this is that, for example, we're talking about university admissions. Yes, I agree with what, we should be paying attention to issues of who has overcome conditions of poverty, other kinds of hardships. But we should also be paying attention to such things as race, ethnicity, and gender. It's not either or. I'm glad we're not talking about how to deal with economic injustice, because I think that's a forum for another night. That's a different discussion. It's an important discussion, but I believe it is very important. It is very important for America not to run away from the difficult issues of race by changing the subject all the time. The challenges ahead just don't permit us that luxury. So I think it does make sense now and again to focus very closely on race. My short answer on the percent plans and the like is that if they work to produce geographical or income diversity, that's terrific. That's a big plus. If they also happen to produce racial and ethnic diversity, enough to satisfy the mission of the institutions, that's fine, and I would favor using them instead of using race, because I think the moral cost is less. However, if they are not effective at producing the racial diversity that I believe is important, then I continue to believe that they should be supplemented by affirmative action that pays attention to race and ethnicity. So I'm very pragmatic about it. Because of the moral cost of paying attention to color, if you don't need to do it, don't do it. But if one of these other devices is in fact not getting the job done, then I think we need to retain affirmative action.
Ward? I want to answer, I think it was Larry's question or his statement that there isn't a person in the room that would say the Irish guy. There is a growing movement, a growing segment of our population that is, quote, multiracial. And it cheapens, it seems to me, the debate about race, the discussion about race, the evolution of how our society is going, to suggest that I cannot lay claim to all of my ancestors. Irish descent, of which I am proud, the Canadian French, of which I am proud, the Choctaw Indian, of which I am proud, and two of my grandparents who are half Irish. You may not want to acknowledge that. You may want to look at me and say, there's a black man. But if I want to acknowledge that, I should have the right to do that. And that segment of the population, my friends, is growing. And we should not put people into a box and say, You are based on your perceptions, your visual perceptions. This is who you are, and I refuse to let you out of that box. That is not the way.
I'm sorry, Senator, let me just quick comment. This is a very important issue, and Ward is sponsoring yet another ballot initiative in California, the Racial Privacy Initiative, which would prohibit the state from collecting data in most of these circumstances on people's race. And I think it's a very important issue, and I must say I think it's a very dangerous issue. Let's separate two different issues. One is the question of your privacy interest, your personal interest in declaring who you are, or in fact, declining to declare who you are.
That's right.
Maybe because you just want to keep it to yourself, or maybe because it's very complicated and the form doesn't have enough boxes to let you accurately portray who you are. That's fine. I respect all of that and certainly do not believe. I can't think of any circumstance in which I would want the government to be able to compel somebody to self-identify. On the other hand, if this kind of data is not collected, how are we going to find out whether there are disparities in education achievement? How are we going to find out whether students with limited English proficiency who are recent immigrants are closing the achievement gap and really gaining? How are we going to find out whether particular state units of government or particular employers or whatever are discriminating unless we have some data collected in order to observe general practices? This kind of initiative, Ward, I have to say, while I appreciate some of the privacy concerns that may motivate it, will bring about a devastating blow to civil rights enforcement, and at least as important, a devastating blow to our efforts to actually measure whether America is making good on its promise of closing the opportunity gap. If you can't name it, if you can't measure it, then you can't address the problem.
With all due respect, you're equally as wrong on this one as you are on preferences, Chris.
I'm consistent.
All right, let's see, right up here, sir. Thank you.
Oh.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, my name is Rashid Towns. I'm a senior here at Harvard College. I'll just be brief because I'm a little bit sort of thunderstruck.
Thank you. We're just about out of time. Thank you.
Professor Edley, you mentioned, I believe, in your book, a very good sort of explanation as to what other alternatives besides affirmative action, like what really can be done, say, on the social level. I don't want to paraphrase it, but I'd like if you could repeat that for you, because I believe you said something along the lines of probably education, targeting the, I think it was Joe's six-pack, for instance, and try to get them to see some of the other benefits of affirmative action. Mr. Connolly, I'd sort of like to ask you about the fluidity of race. You said earlier on that race is fluid, but then you later on you also mentioned that perhaps some things like such as church are very segregated. I'm a little bit confused. It seems like your almost answer to the fluidity of race would be, say, ballot initiatives or things like that. I'm a little bit confused if you can expand that on me, because I can tell you from my experience as a Boston, Massachusetts native, and who also lives in a very quote-unquote liberal Lexington town, that race very, very much matters. And if I go to a job, if I go inside a store, if I go in a bank, or if I want to meet someone who doesn't happen to have my hue. Thank you very much.
The process we've been following for the last 30 years or so is the race matters philosophy, that in order to reduce the influence of race, we have to practice race consciousness. I just fundamentally reject that. I think that if we want to eliminate or diffuse the influence of race, we have to practice, stop being race conscious. There are a number of studies that suggest this is not some naive notion, that people can be taught not to be conscious of race, not to classify people. Scientists are coming out with this information. And so I'm submitting to you an alternative here. Rather than race consciousness and saying that we have to use race in order to get beyond race, that we should start practicing in our public sector that which more and more I think we're doing in our private sector.
And this would sort of trickle down along from the public sector, from the government?
I'm not sure if it's trickled down, but I think that government, by its practices, can make race less important, less consequential in our lives.
Let's go right here if we could, please, sir.
Hey. My name is Al Smith, and I'm a graduate student here at the Kennedy School. And the kid that was here before me, Brahm, yeah, I've seen him hang out with black people once or twice before. for those of you that might know him and know me, and I think it's because of affirmative action, PPIA programs, and the such. But let me start out. I heard Mr. Connolly's conservative view of affirmative action, but I also know that advocates of affirmative action are trying to push it. So, Professor Edley, why are the conservatives winning? And can you tell me, can you give me some tools that I can take back to these people that are telling me can affirmative action, and how do I challenge that and be productive?
Chris?
Well, I think one reason that, well, first of all, you know, to the extent that they're winning, I think one reason they're winning is not enough people are buying my book. And I really think that I would say to all of you that you really you need to read my book.
Got it.
Or at least buy it. At least buy it. You don't have to read it because it is so good. Okay, so in all seriousness, here's what I believe. I guess I'm fond of saying that this is not rocket science. This is harder than rocket science. Right? Rocket science is easy, right? Put a man on the moon, 10 years, no problem. Race, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and we still can't get it right. This is harder than rocket science. And that means that if you're going to try to lead on this issue, you have to be prepared to work at getting good at it. Right? Better than cocktail party conversation. Right? You've got to be able to really think about this knucklehead. But there's a kernel of truth in what he's saying. And I've got to try to understand what the kernel of truth is in what he's saying. Because if I will recognize that, then I'm in a position to insist that he do the same toward me. Right? So the first point I'd say is we got to treat it as a hard problem. The second point I'd say is it's kind of like welfare reform. When I worked in the Carter administration on welfare reform, I was up on the Hill lobbying for welfare reform for the White House back in the days when welfare reform meant spending more money on poor people. And I was arguing about all of these policy details. And the politicians on the Hill were saying, but my constituents don't think we ought to be spending more money. My constituents are interested in the debate about who's deserving and who's not, about single-parent families, about out-of-wedlock births. In other words, conservatives were arguing about values while progressives were doing the policy plumbing. This debate is about values discourse. And if supporters of affirmative action engage only on the plane of equal protection doctrine and who's going to write a better brief, instead of engaging on the plane of values, we're going to wake up one day and find out that the American people are more interested in values debate than they are in plumbing. So those are the two things that I'd say as to what we have to do if we want to be more effective at fighting this battle.
1, 2, 3. Very quick, crisp, hurry.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
My name is Graham O'Donoghue, and I'm a senior at the college. I have a question for Professor Edley. As I understand your argument, there are two goals for affirmative action. One is to dismantle the racial caste system, which leads to discrimination or propagates it. And the other is to achieve excellence by picking out people, as you said, the analogy of picking the oboist for the oboe spot. About the second goal, isn't it in some ways antithetical to the first, in that if you identify excellence with race and think that someone with a particular race must be excellent and right for a particular spot, isn't that directly antithetical to the goal of dismantling the racial caste system, which relies on identity and race being linked?
That's a whole nother forum. All right, let's don't take this yet, Chris. Chris,
thank you
right
very,
here, please,
very much.
quickly.
My name is Robert L. Hall, Sr., and I'm a Republican also. And so I don't want you to think that I'm totally conservative. I just want to make sure that there are some diversity. I just want to, because we had a format here and we kind of got off of it. So I was listening to a lecture here. So I just want to ask my question because I'm a common man, and I come from the Malik El Sabah's class. My hypothetical question is, how do we address the injustices of the African American male and the Hispanic males, the common folks in the community, who 1 out of every 4 have been to prison or when our very sick Hispanic have been to prison, how do we reinstitute them back into the process as far as affirmative access to and handicap and disabled folks, and have them have an opportunity to go to Harvard or Princeton or Yale, because they have lives and families. So if we're going to talk about affirmative action, tell me how we're going to design that program so that we can get more inclusion into the program.
A very, very provocative question. Let's put that in our calibration here just a moment. One question right here, right quick.
Yeah, my name is Andrew Pacelli. I'm a sophomore in the college. I'd just first like to respond to my classmate who wondered why the conservatives were winning. And I was a little disappointed by that because it just seems to me, off the subject, that justice and equality are not things that should really follow along the lines of liberal or conservative parties. But to the question, if our goal is to create a society where differences are given equal respect, it seems to me that affirmative action can have the very real effect of isolating arbitrary differences and enlarging them at the expense of a person's whole character. What this means is that there are very real detrimental consequences to affirmative action in the form of stigmatization. So even if it does enhance the experience of a classroom to have diversity for diversity's sake, there are consequences and harms for races as a whole. If I am qualified for a job, I wouldn't want anyone to think that I am there.
I'm sorry, we have to have a question.
We got the point.
Okay, let's take these three questions on the floor. Ward, would you like to go first, or Chris?
Well, this format's getting a little puzzling to me. I mean,
Yes.
there's several
It is to
questions
me.
embedded in there. First of all, with regard to your question, I think we really have to examine this notion that we want to send everybody to college. I really do. I think that it's skewing the options we provide to people, regardless of race. Skewing the options that we provide to people. You either go, as one said, either to Yale or jail. And there are no other options, we seem to think. You either go to Berkeley or your life is in ruins. So I think we need to really re-examine this whole business about how much emphasis we're placing on going to college. That's a separate question. The other thing is, why are the conservatives winning? You know, I must have had 10 people describe me as conservative. If I'm the conservative who holds one view, why is he not the liberal who's holding the other view? But you never point to that. It's always the conservative, and because of that,
I'm a liberal.
And because of that, and I'm conservative. But because of that, I think we get trapped. We get trapped with these labels and in these ideological boxes that we don't like to crawl out of and see where we can hold hands maybe and find some solution to a problem. And I think that the university is one of the places that is trapped more in its own ideology than any place else. If somebody is conservative, you don't want to walk out of that and say, well, gee, maybe there's something there that I can agree with. I've changed my view on 4 or 5 different issues as a regent involving admission standards because I thought it made the process better. So I would urge you not to get enslaved to this notion of conservative versus liberal. Think about what's right, go over and try to engage the other point of view, but don't get locked in this business about why the conservatives are winning or why the liberals are winning. If it's the right thing to do, it doesn't matter who's winning. It doesn't matter.
Chris?
Well, let me try to touch on a couple of things. Certainly, I think some of the problems, sir, that you were raising in terms about, I think you call average people, is it common people, common folks. Look, this goes back to my point: is that affirmative action is not a remedy for all maladies. Affirmative action is not a remedy for all maladies. The importance of some of the social and economic problems that you were talking about, I agree completely. I mean, I care passionately about a number of them and work a great deal on a lot of them. The connection to affirmative action is tenuous. So, I mean, I hope we can have. I'd love to participate in another forum, Senator, on some of the other social policy issues that we're talking about. This is not about, at least in my mind, about racial essentialism. Affirmative action done correctly does not reduce somebody to nothing but the color of their skin or to their sex. That's not what it's about. It's about looking at the entire person and asking, what can this entire person contribute to our mission? It is also the case that, I mean, not all people of color obviously are fungible. One of the things I want the white students in my class to learn is that the black students and the Latino students and the Asian students have different views about different things, that there is that we are not monolithic. And affirmative action done the right way will in fact produce that learning by the white students who will benefit from affirmative action because their educations will be better. Stigma, look, folks, a generation ago, people in my situation who wanted to change the country got clubbed, got beaten, got lynched. So the fact that I start every semester feeling in my mind that I have to convince my students that I deserve to be a professor at the Harvard Law School, I mean, that's just a little burden of my generation, right? It would be hubris of me to whine about the fact that there's a little bit of stigma that I have to confront at the Harvard Law School. Nobody has clubbed me over the head. I hope that in the progress of America, what my son faces will be less than what I face. But stigma, listen, I agree, there is a cost to affirmative action, but I think it's a cost we should be willing to pay.
I'm going to ask our two panelists to do a 2-minute summation each. Ward, would you like to start? And Chris, then I have an announcement.
I know that I have profound differences with many of you in this room, not all, about this issue. But I think the greatest contribution that black Americans have made to this nation is the proposition that all people should be treated as equals. We made that contribution. The nation's better for it. Not given a preference, not more equal than others, but by the government, we should be treated as equals. That is an enormous contribution that we have made. I don't want to cheapen that. I don't want to say that I expect something from my society that I'm not willing to give to somebody else because of the color of their skin. Civil Rights Act of '64 was the right thing to do. Go back and read it sometimes. It says that we would all be treated as equals without regard to the color of our skin. I don't know how you can parse that any more than the words themselves. It doesn't mean that you treat people differently in the interest of excellence, whatever that means. I don't want my rights to be contingent upon what my dear friend Chris thinks is excellent for that institution. I don't want to submit an application and wonder whether my skin color is going to be regarded as contributing to the excellence of that institution. I want to know, as an individual, am I going to be treated on my merits without regard to my race or what he believes my race is?
Chris?
Well, Ward, first let me say thank you, and I've actually enjoyed this. I generally hate debates, but it's been good to see you again. But you rewrote the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It says you can't discriminate. It doesn't say you can't think about. It doesn't say you can't pay attention to. And it leaves to us to wrestle with the question of what constitutes discrimination. It's not rocket science. What I would urge everyone to do is go through a little experiment and ask yourself, what would racial justice look like if we had it? What would the society look like? The exercise I go through is to imagine sometime in the future a Martian coming to look at the United States, a Martian named de Tocqueville, and ask, what do you expect, what's that Martian going to see? One thing I do want the Martian to see is that opportunity is so broadly distributed and so widely shared that you see no visible evidence that this was a society with a history of color caste, of slavery, of conquest. To find out that that was our history, the Martian would have to talk to grandparents and go to libraries. But I'd also want the Martian to see that we not only recognize, but we celebrate our differences. Not that we've all been somehow mushed together, but that and not that we simply tolerate our differences, but that we celebrate them and recognize them as a source of personal strength and collective betterment. Now, the first step, it seems to me, in getting beyond our disputes over race is to try to share our visions of what racial justice means. And the second step, then, is to debate how best to get there. Ward and I disagree profoundly on the practicality at this moment in American history of pretending that race is inconsequential. My view is that the problems are too hard, too deep, and too serious to solve with a blindfold on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Before we finally show our appreciation for our two very distinguished panelists, let me remind you that Friday at 4 o'clock right here, the future of the Democratic Party, James Carville, Barney Frank, Al Fromm, Congresswoman Ellen Tauscher, David Nyan, moderator. Monday at 6 o'clock, the future of the Republican Party, Alan Simpson, William Crystal, Steve Goldsmith, Juliana Glover-Weiss, David Gergen. Two fabulous panels. Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock, Harvard students only. I'm sorry, you will be carded. This will not take place in the forum, but we're moving up to Sanders Theater. We're having the junior senator from the state of New York, Hillary Rodham Clinton. So that will be at 3 o'clock on Monday. And then Tuesday, we have Christine Amalpour, who is here, the chief international correspondent for CNN, 8 o'clock right here. Ernest Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, and he will be here on Wednesday. I tell you what, I don't know how you can get any better than that. And I don't know how we can get any better than this tonight. Let's give both of our panelists a big round of applause. Great.
I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciate so much everything you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Don't forget the debate in the conference room right here, the debate that continues in just a moment.